knows I'm not one of anything and that I am the GOAT.
The phrase "I couldn't manage" tells you everything you need to know about this video and the man at the center of it. Paul Heyman is the greatest talker in the history of professional wrestling. Not one of the greatest, the greatest. Full stop. He built ECW from the ground up in a small hall in Philadelphia. He made fans care about fighters they had never heard of. He turned Brock Lesnar into a force that felt unstoppable. He gave CM Punk the words to match his fire. He took Roman Reigns and added a real darkness that changed everything. And if you want more stories like this one, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype right now as we count down the 10 wrestlers that even Paul Heyman could not manage. Because here is the honest truth about Paul Heyman. He is not a magician. He is a multiplier.
That when he comes back, he's going to appreciate this even more than he already does.
He can take what is already living inside a wrestler and make it louder and bigger and more dangerous than that wrestler could ever produce alone. He can make a crowd believe in someone faster than that person could ever build belief by themselves. He can construct a story out of nothing and fill it with enough fire and feeling to make an entire arena genuinely care. When Paul Heyman chooses to stand beside you and call you his client, that choice carries enormous weight inside professional wrestling. The crowd notices, the locker room notices, the entire industry sits up and pays attention because everyone knows what that endorsement is supposed to mean. But there is a ceiling on what even the greatest talker in the business can do. There is a hard and real limit on the reach of his power, and that ceiling has a very specific and revealing shape. It looks like 10 names. 10 wrestlers who stood beside Paul Heyman and still could not reach the level his words were promising night after night. 10 pairings where something fundamental was missing, where the chemistry experiment produced smoke instead of fire. This video is about those 10 names. And more importantly, it is about the exact reasons each case fell apart the way it did. Because understanding why something failed is almost always more interesting than simply announcing that it did. Before we get to the names, a few things need to be said clearly. This is not about placing all of the blame on the wrestlers alone. Some of them were genuinely talented people who could perform at a very high level. Some had real ability and real potential that is hard to argue with. Some were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, paired with a brilliant manager whose genuine attention was pointed in a completely different direction. In most of these cases, the failure was shared. The wrestler had a problem, the manager had a problem, the company had a problem. All of those layers added up, and the result was a pairing that produced nothing lasting. But fairness also requires honesty about the other side of that. Paul Heyman has, in several of these specific cases, been a contributing part of the reason things went wrong. Not through cruelty or bad intentions, but through distraction, through a focus pointing at someone other than the client beside him, and through a brand that sometimes created its own heavy pressure. When you carry the Paul Heyman endorsement, the audience immediately measures you against the best clients he has ever had. They think about Brock Lesnar, they think about CM Punk. If you cannot match those benchmarks in some visible and meaningful way, the endorsement that was supposed to lift you starts to work against you instead. That is the curse that comes built into the blessing. 10 wrestlers, starting at number 10 and working all the way down to number 1. These are the men Paul Heyman could not manage. Before we go through each name, it helps to understand the patterns that explain why these situations collapse the way they do. The first reason is that the pairing has to feel like it was born naturally rather than assembled in a production meeting. When Paul stood beside Brock Lesnar for the first time, it felt inevitable. Lesnar was a physical destroyer with no desire to speak for himself. Heyman was a speaker who needed a force of nature to give his words full weight. They completed each other without any visible effort. No machinery showed behind the partnership. When a pairing feels constructed rather than discovered, modern wrestling fans sense that gap quickly. They can feel when a manager has been handed to someone as a patch job rather than a genuine creative choice. Once that feeling settles, it is nearly impossible to reverse no matter how hard anyone works. The second reason is the gap between the promise and the delivery in the ring. Paul Heyman is extraordinary at the microphone. He can build a man in words to such a height that the crowd is genuinely excited and afraid in equal measure. But those words are promises, and those promises require the wrestler to keep them inside the ropes every single night. When matches are flat, when chemistry between performers is simply absent, when a supposedly unstoppable force looks slow or out of place, the audience starts measuring every claim Paul made against every disappointing moment they have watched. The gap between promo and performance stops being invisible. The third reason is time and what it does to every body. Every wrestler operates on a physical clock that nobody can slow. At peak, a performance performer moves sharply, recovers quickly, and sustains their level on a demanding schedule. When that peak passes, the decline is visible to everyone in the building, regardless of what ringside commentary is promising. No manager in history has talked those years back. The clock runs forward. It does not respond to even the greatest promo ever delivered. Some entries are caught by several at once. Others are almost entirely about just one. Number 10 is where we begin. Number 10, Jimmy Snuka. Before we discuss the failure, we have to honestly acknowledge what Jimmy Snuka was at his genuine peak. In the early 1980s, he was something professional wrestling had never produced before. He moved through the air with a freedom that left crowds completely stunned. He was called the Superfly, and that name was not a decorative nickname. It was a literal description of what audiences saw when he competed. He was a high flyer at a time when the concept of high flying in wrestling was brand new and genuinely revolutionary to the people watching it for the first time. The moment that locked his name into wrestling history came in 1982 at Madison Square Garden inside a steel cage. Snuka climbed to the top of that cage and leaped from it. The response from the crowd was something close to disbelief turned into pure noise. That single image echoed forward through decades of wrestling history after it happened. Men who later became legends in their own right pointed back to that leap and said it was the precise moment they decided they wanted to spend their lives inside this business. Mick Foley said it. Tommy Dreamer said it. That jump is carved permanently into the history of this sport, and nothing can take it away. So when Paul Heyman launched ECW in 1992 and urgently needed his brand new company to be taken seriously by the audience, bringing in Jimmy Snuka as the first heavyweight champion was a logical and understandable move. Hayman was building from nothing in a small Philadelphia hall. He needed a name the audience already respected and recognized before they set foot through the door. He needed some borrowed history while his own was being created week by week. He stood beside Snuka on hardcore TV and framed the veteran as a dominant and powerful force. In those earliest weeks, the plan had a clear and sensible logic behind it, but the reality in the ring could not be hidden from anyone paying close attention. By 1992, Snuka was in his late 40s. He had been wrestling professionally for close to 2 decades at that point. The version of Snuka that had inspired a generation of performers was a memory. What remained was a man carrying the full weight of everything those years had demanded from his body. The sharpness was gone. The speed was gone. The in-ring performance that had made him a revolutionary figure no longer existed in the form that had earned his legendary status. Hayman could describe him as a dominant force in every promo. The ring told a different story every single night, regardless of what was said before the match started. His role in ECW was designed to be transitional from the start. He was there to give the company an immediate foundation, while Hayman built a genuine identity underneath him. And that identity was moving fast in a very specific direction, darker and harder and more extreme by the week. The traditional wrestling style that Snuka represented simply did not fit the future rushing toward them. By 1994, when the Extreme Championship wrestling name and identity took full hold over everything the company did, Snuka had already faded from the picture. Not because Hayman abandoned him, because the biological clock made the final decision long before either of them had a say in it. Management cannot write new chapters for a career that has already reached its final one. Number 9, Bobby Eaton. Bobby Eaton is one of the most technically skilled professional wrestlers the National Wrestling Alliance ever produced. Inside the ring, he performed at a level of consistent excellence that very few people in the history of this sport have matched over a sustained career. As one half of the Midnight Express, he helped establish a standard for tag team wrestling that the entire industry looked up to. His peers held him in enormously high regard. Watching him work a match was an education in how to structure a wrestling match properly from the opening exchange to the finish. When Paul Heyman, performing as Paul E. dangerously in WCW, assembled the Dangerous Alliance faction in 1991, Eaton was included as a core member. The group was stacked with genuine talent at every position. Arn Anderson was part of it. Larry Zbyszko brought hard-earned experience and veteran credibility. Rick Rude arrived with real star power and a physical presence that drew genuine reactions. And a younger performer named Steve Austin was still developing and finding his voice inside the stable alongside these established names. Placing Bobby Eaton inside that unit looked like thoughtful and well-considered booking that would provide him with a new and legitimate platform at a point in his career when he could benefit from one. Number 8, Nathan Jones. Nathan Jones arrived in professional wrestling carrying every physical quality that looks impressive from a distance. 7 feet tall, built with enormous physical power, a former strongman from Australia, and carrying a nickname designed to make people feel genuinely uncomfortable, the Colossus of Bago Road. Paul Heyman looked at all of that and immediately saw the architecture of a monster project waiting to be built into something memorable. He positioned Jones as a powerful henchman for the biggest names on the SmackDown brand. He placed him in close proximity to The Undertaker and Brock Lesnar. The launch position for a brand new arrival in WWE could hardly have been more prominent than what Jones was given from the very beginning. But the version of Nathan Jones that existed on paper and the version that showed up in real life were separated by a gap that could not be closed from any direction. The physical gifts were real and obvious to everyone who looked. What was entirely missing lived inside the man himself, in a place that no manager could access or repair. Professional wrestling demands a very particular and specific kind of determination from the people who attempt to build a career inside it. The travel schedule is unrelenting. The physical demands accumulate in ways that cannot be fully appreciated from outside. And the backstage culture inside a major wrestling company tests new arrivals through forms of pressure and teasing that the audience watching at home never witnesses. Jones was being ribbed by his veteran colleagues, and the games were affecting him in ways he could not shake off and leave behind when he left the building each night. The breaking point came during a tour of Australia in late 2003. Jones arrived at the arena. He was scheduled to compete that evening, and then, with only minutes remaining before his entrance was due, he left the building and did not return to the company. In later interviews, he was direct and honest about the whole situation. Wrestling was simply not for him. The determination that a professional wrestling career demands at every single level was something he did not possess in the measure the job required. He had the body of a professional wrestler without any question. He did not have the heart of one. Paul Heyman can build a monster with words and make a crowd genuinely believe in the threat of what is approaching through that curtain, but he cannot manufacture passion in a man who does not burn for this work. The will to endure and push through what professional wrestling asks of its performers every day is something only the individual can find inside themselves. Nathan Jones looked for it and found it was not there in any form that could be developed or encouraged from the outside. He later confirmed that wrestling was not his calling. That admission does not change what it cost the project Paul had built around him. Number 7, Heidenreich. In WWE, a program with The Undertaker is a carefully protected and managed commodity. It carries specific and important meaning within the company. The Undertaker was not a resource extended to new arrivals on the roster without considerable thought. His opponents were chosen because the long-term credibility of everything surrounding his character demanded quality and genuine commitment from whoever was sharing the inside that organization. When Heidenreich was given that opportunity with Paul Heyman standing at ringside managing him, the company was making a very public and very expensive investment statement about where it intended his career to go. The audience did not accept the premise of the investment. The matches between Heidenreich and The Undertaker were described widely and consistently as major disappointments by the people watching them. The chemistry between the two performers was simply not present in any workable or buildable form. Heidenreich was a large and physically powerful man, but physical size alone, without the ring psychology and the timing that makes professional wrestling feel genuinely threatening and real, produces something that a live audience can immediately sense is not functioning. They could feel the effort being expended. When effort is the dominant impression rather than the story, something critical is absent from the equation. Hayman did the work he was placed there to do. He built Heidenreich in promos as a volatile and genuinely dangerous threat. He tried to make the pairing carry a feeling of real menace and unpredictability from the ringside position, but the ring work could not carry the weight of those promises night after night. When the partnership between Heidenreich and Hayman ended, Heidenreich was moved into a tag team situation with Road Warrior Animal as an attempt to find him a more manageable environment where his limitations would not be as exposed. That experiment also produced nothing lasting. He departed the industry not long after, leaving behind a run that never came close to justifying the scale of the opportunity and the investment that had been placed behind him. Number 6, Matt Morgan. Matt Morgan possessed a physical profile that would make any wrestling promoter look twice and immediately start imagining possibilities. He stood 7 feet tall. He moved with a natural athleticism that his frame made genuinely surprising to watch. His nickname was the Blueprint, deliberately chosen to suggest he represented the ideal physical design for what a dominant professional wrestler should be built like, still at the very beginning of everything. But the creative decisions made around him actively worked against the investment from the very first moment anyone saw him perform. Matt Morgan was handed a stuttering gimmick. The character he was asked to perform stuttered visibly and consistently during promos and segments. Whatever the intended creative effect was behind that specific decision, the actual reality was that it produced the exact opposite of what the situation required. A man positioned as a dominant and physically threatening force cannot project that dominance convincingly if the character reads as uncomfortable and uncertain every single time he opens his mouth. The contradiction was stark and impossible to paper over, regardless of what else was happening in the presentation around him. Hayman was the voice of this character, meant to cover the verbal dimension of the character and present Morgan as a legitimate physical threat the audience should genuinely fear and respect. Those gifts deserved a properly and thoughtfully constructed platform on which to develop. That platform never came in a form that allowed him any chance to use them. The combined effect of the stuttering gimmick and the lack of clear creative direction meant that Morgan was undermined before he ever had a genuine opportunity to demonstrate what he was actually capable of. Number 5. Curtis Axel. Joe Hennig carried wrestling in his family lineage in a way that very few performers in this sport can genuinely claim. His grandfather was Larry the Axe Hennig. His father was Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, a deeply beloved performer who delivered some of the most fondly remembered and technically impressive character work in WWE history across his career. When the company rebranded Joe as Curtis Axel in May 2013 and introduced him to the audience through Paul Heyman, the presentation carried real and immediate energy. Heyman stepped to the microphone and stated with full conviction that Curtis Axel had accomplished more in a single evening than his father and grandfather had managed across their entire combined careers. That level of Heyman introduction is a significant event in itself, and it immediately placed the audience on notice that something new was being built. Axel won the Intercontinental Championship during this run. He had a title belt around his waist. He had the backing of the most respected mouthpiece in the industry standing physically at his side. He had a family name that carried genuine emotional history and recognizable weight with a large portion of the audience. Every component that a young wrestler could reasonably want appeared to be in place at exactly the same time. And yet none of it combined to make the crowd feel that something genuinely special was in the process of being built. The quality that makes a performer separate themselves from the crowd of names on a roster, the quality that makes an audience decide this person genuinely matters and deserves their investment, was simply not visible in him. Observers describe this plainly as negative charisma, not merely an absence of screen presence, but an active resistance to the kind of emotional connection a crowd needs to feel in order to care. When Paul Heyman's extraordinary verbal abilities are operating at full capacity at the microphone, and the crowd still cannot be moved toward a specific individual, the problem runs deeper than any manager can realistically be expected to solve on their own. Layered beneath all of that was a structural failure from the company itself. The creative team wanted to use the Hennig family legacy as the spine of an ongoing story. They started building in that direction, and then they retreated from it before the story had developed enough room and enough time to grow into something the audience could follow with genuine investment over weeks and months. Axel later spoke about this directly, noting that the company had him in mind for a real legacy-based character push and then stepped away from it without committing to a clear finish. Without a story built around a consistent and compelling reason for the audience to care, the association with Paul Heyman became a footnote rather than a foundation for anything lasting. He drifted progressively down through the card, the flavor of a month that left no mark on anyone who witnessed it. Number 4. Ryback. The alliance between Ryback and Paul Heyman in late 2013 has been studied and discussed more extensively by wrestling fans and industry observers than perhaps any other pairing on this entire list. Ryback had been building real and loud momentum as a babyface over a significant period. The Feed Me More character had connected with crowds in a genuine and enthusiastic way that was difficult to dismiss. He was big and physical and aggressive and felt different from most of the options available on the roster at that specific time. There was authentic crowd support behind him, but that momentum eventually hit a wall it could not push past. The company decided the route forward was a heel turn and an alignment with Heyman to provide the character with new direction and give it the credibility it needed to develop further. The logic behind the decision was understandable and clear on paper. Heyman would supply the verbal dimension that Ryback consistently struggled to generate convincingly on his own. He would make the complete package feel believable and give the heel persona the depth it was missing. He would give the turn genuine meaning, but the audience refused to accept the arrangement. They looked at the two of them standing together and did not feel a natural or organic connection between them. What they felt was the presence of a management solution, a skilled mouthpiece deployed to repair something the audience had already identified as broken. That reading took hold almost immediately, and it refused to loosen its grip. The context surrounding the pairing made everything considerably worse. At the same time, Heyman was deeply involved in his ongoing feud with CM Punk, a story carrying years of genuine and earned history underneath it, along with deep emotional investment from the fans who had watched it develop across those years. Ryback was placed inside that story not as the main subject of a narrative being actively and carefully built for his benefit, but as a temporary obstacle in the path of someone else's journey. The difference between being genuinely built up and being used up in service of someone else's story is enormous for any wrestler trying to generate lasting upward momentum. One creates something durable, the other depletes without leaving anything behind. Hidden behind all of this was a physical reality the audience was never given access to. Ryback had been managing serious spinal problems for an extended and difficult period. He had undergone medical procedures designed to avoid more drastic surgical intervention. His body was genuinely struggling to deliver consistently at the level that Paul's promos were promising on his behalf. When the alliance ended, there was no story waiting on the other side of it and no base of accumulated momentum to stand on going forward. He left the company in time to address his health. He needed more than a world-class manager. He needed a story that was genuinely constructed around him and a physical foundation that was capable of honoring it night after night. Number 3, Cesaro. If any single entry on this entire list still generates a real and immediate emotional response from wrestling fans years after it happened, it is this one. At WrestleMania 30, Cesaro won the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, and the crowd reaction was enormous and genuinely enthusiastic. He had been building real and visible momentum for a significant stretch of time before that particular night. His giant swing had become one of the most anticipated and genuinely celebrated moves in all of professional wrestling during that period. Audiences were invested in watching him climb. The energy around him felt like the very beginning stages of something major taking shape for a performer who had clearly worked hard to earn that reaction. And then Paul Heyman appeared at his side. The idea of adding a Paul Heyman pairing to a wrestler already genuinely popular with the crowd sounds like a dream scenario in theory. You take something that is already working and you amplify it beyond what it could ever achieve on its own. But that is not what was done here. Cesaro was turned heel and placed alongside the heel Hayman. The fundamental and immediate problem was that the crowd had not been given any reason to stop cheering for him. They still liked Cesaro. They responded positively to him every single time he stepped through the ropes and performed. And now they were being told to see him as a villain they should resent. The confusion this created was felt and visible every single week without resolution. Then came the structural damage that ultimately did the most lasting and difficult to repair harm. During this entire stretch of time, Paul Heyman was completely and deeply absorbed in the story of Brock Lesnar having ended The Undertaker's undefeated WrestleMania streak. That was the dominant and overwhelming story in Heyman's professional world. Every promo he delivered found its way back to that single event and to Brock Lesnar. Every piece of camera time he received was used to keep that particular narrative alive and prominent in the audience's mind. Cesaro stood at ringside and waited for his own story to be told by the man who was supposed to be there specifically to tell it. That moment barely arrived across the entire duration of the pairing. He was the justification for Paul's weekly television appearances, not the subject of Paul's actual creative energy or focus. The difference between being someone's excuse to be on television and being someone's genuine priority is everything when you are trying to build real momentum in a career. The giant swing was also removed from his in-ring work during this period as a creative decision intended to generate heel heat by taking away the move the crowd loved most about him. Anyone could identify. When it finally ended, most of what WrestleMania 30 had built for Cesaro had been quietly spent without producing anything meaningful or lasting in return. This case stands as the sharpest and most painful example on this entire list of what happens when a manager's genuine focus and attention belong entirely to someone else. Number 2, Shelton Benjamin. Shelton Benjamin may be the finest pure athlete to have competed inside a WWE ring over any significant sustained period of time. That is not casual or convenient praise. It reflects the genuine and considered opinion of people who worked alongside him and watched him perform at the highest level night after night across years of demanding competition. He was fast. He was strong. His body control was extraordinary in ways that went well beyond what most people understand simple athleticism to mean. He could take a moment in a match that should have dissolved entirely into awkwardness and convert it into something the crowd was still discussing long after they had gone home from the show. His technical skill was as close to genuinely flawless as this sport regularly produces. He left audiences amazed consistently and almost without effort. So why did his time in the orbit of Paul Heyman never produce the World Championship run that those physical gifts strongly suggested was possible and arguably deserved? The answer focuses on one specific area that never found a resolution. Shelton Benjamin could not connect with the crowd through words in the way that ultimately separates mid-card performers from main event performers in professional wrestling. He was exceptional inside the ring at an elite level, but professional wrestling demands two complete and equally important forms of performance, the physical one and the spoken one. Hayman was positioned beside him to bridge the verbal gap and provide Shelton with the voice that Shelton himself struggled to produce convincingly for the audience. The core conflict that prevented the pairing from working was something that ran directly against the goal. Shelton was so genuinely brilliant inside the ring that the crowd found it nearly impossible to boo him even when they were being clearly asked to. He was operating in a heel context alongside a heel manager. The audience was supposed to turn against him, but every single time he delivered a breathtaking sequence or a genuinely extraordinary athletic moment inside those ropes, the positive crowd reaction came flooding back, regardless of the managerial framing or the heel positioning. The alignment between what Hayman was asking the crowd to feel about Shelton and what the crowd actually felt in their gut every time they watched him perform was completely and stubbornly off. The crowd's direct in-ring experience of Shelton was too powerful and too real for any narrative applied from the outside to override it. That tonal conflict had no clean solution available from the ringside position. It was a pairing that fought itself at every turn. Shelton Benjamin deserved a story built around exactly what he was, rather than a role that required the crowd to pretend he was something he was not. Number 1. A-Train. The number 1 spot on this list belongs to A-Train, the name Matt Bloom carried through the ruthless aggression era in WWE. A-Train came to the roster with real physical credentials that were not invented or easy to dismiss with a glance. He was large and physically powerful and moved with a surprising agility that his considerable frame did not initially suggest was available. He was technically reliable as a performer and showed up consistently to do his job professionally and without creating difficulties for anyone working around him. In a creative environment that valued imposing physical performers and was actively searching to develop new ones who could fill that role, he appeared reasonably positioned for something meaningful to develop over time. It did not develop. Despite his genuine physical qualities and despite the creative support available on the SmackDown brand during a period when Paul Heyman held significant influence over the direction of that show, A-Train never climbed in any sustained way above the mid-card level of the card. The audience consistently and persistently treated him as a filler character, someone who occupied a slot on the show without truly owning it or generating any particular reaction from the crowd when his music played. Breaking free of that kind of settled audience perception requires a defining story or a genuinely defining moment that forces a complete reassessment of the person you're looking at. Neither arrived for A-Train during his time in WWE. What came after his WWE chapter is the most instructive and telling part of the whole story. He left WWE and made his way to Japan, where performing under the name Giant Bernard, he became a genuine star with real and hard-earned crowd investment and legitimate credibility. That success, built in a completely different context, makes one thing absolutely and undeniably clear. The problem was never his talent as a performer. The problem was fit. The specific combination of audience expectation, roster depth, and creative culture inside WWE during that particular era was simply not the right environment for what A-Train had to offer. Even with Paul Heyman's influence present and active on the brand, the root of the problem was one of ecosystem and context. Cesaro felt the full and painful weight of this most clearly on this entire list. He stood beside Paul for months while Paul was completely absorbed in the story of Brock Lesnar and the end of the Undertaker's streak. Being someone's excuse for appearing on television is not the same as being someone's genuine priority. The fourth is the differentiating spark that cannot be installed from any position outside the performer themselves. The charisma, the presence, the quality inside a wrestler that makes a crowd decide this specific person is different from everyone else on the card. Curtis Axel did not have it in the measure required. A-Train did not have it for that audience in that environment. Shelton Benjamin possessed a version of it, but it worked in entirely the wrong direction for the role being asked of him. That spark lives inside a performer, or it does not live at all. The fifth is stability, the mental and physical capacity to endure what professional wrestling asks of its performers across the full length of a demanding career. Nathan Jones broke before his run had even properly started. Heidenreich could not sustain the level the push demanded. Ryback was physically compromised in ways that were invisible from the outside. The spotlight Paul Heyman creates is enormous, and it is relentless. Standing inside it requires someone who is genuinely built to carry that weight without being consumed by it over time. Paul Heyman is a multiplier. He is not a maker. He takes what is already present inside a performer and amplifies it. He gives it shape and volume and language that a crowd can hold on to and feel. He makes good things great and great things something approaching legendary. But a multiplier working against a zero still produces a zero. The multiplication does not change what the base actually is. If the base is fragile or wrongly directed or past its best or absent in the first place, the amplification only makes the underlying problem louder and more visible to everyone watching from the crowd and from backstage. The 10 men on this list are not simply failures. They are the proof. Evidence of exactly how rare and precise precise and delicate the conditions must be for what Paul Heyman does to produce its full and extraordinary effect. Brock Lesnar was those conditions. CM Punk was those conditions. Roman Reigns was those conditions. These 10 were not. And the fact that those conditions are so genuinely rare is precisely what makes the times Paul Heyman gets it perfectly right feel like something close to magic. These were the 10 wrestlers that even Paul Heyman could not manage. And every single reason why makes every success he has ever produced that much more extraordinary and that much harder to replicate.